So, me caveman, let's go. Number 10. Tollund Man. On the 8th of May, 1950, two brothers were cutting peat in a bog called Bjelskovdal, about 10 kilometers west of the town of Silkeborg in central Denmark. Emil and Viggo Højgaard were digging fuel out of the wet black earth when their spades uncovered a face. It was a man's face, calm and complete, the eyes closed, the lips slightly parted, stubble still on the chin. He looked as though he had died an hour before. The brothers did what any of us would do. They called the police. The police were right to be puzzled, because the man in the bog had been dead for more than 2,000 years. He lay about 2.5 meters below the modern surface, curled on his side with his knees drawn up, as if asleep. When the preeminent Danish archaeologist P.V. Glob was called in, he recognized at once that this was no recent crime. Radiocarbon dating would later place the death somewhere around 400 BC, in the pre-Roman Iron Age. What makes Tollund Man so unsettling is how gently the horror is hidden. Around his neck was a braided leather cord, pulled tight. He had been hanged. Yet his face carried no terror at all. He wore a pointed sheepskin cap tied under the chin, and a smooth hide belt, and nothing else. His last meal, still sitting in his gut, was a porridge of barley flax and dozens of wild seeds, eaten roughly 12 to 24 hours before he died. There was no meat in it. How does a face survive when a coffin cannot? The answer is chemistry. The bog is cold, acidic, and starved of oxygen. Sphagnum moss releases a compound that binds nitrogen and shuts down the bacteria that would normally consume a body. The skin was tanned like leather, but that same acid slowly dissolved most of his bones. Only the head, the feet, and a single thumb were preserved in their original state. The rest of the body you see in the museum today is a reconstruction. The head itself was saved by a pioneering method in 1950, dried in a series of solvents, and then soaked with wax. Why was he killed? The mainstream reading is ritual sacrifice, common across Iron Age Northern Europe. Others argue he was a criminal executed by hanging. A more speculative view sees him as an offering to a fertility deity in a hard season. A study in 2021 even found the parasites still in his gut. His peaceful face hides a violent death. The next body makes that violence impossible to ignore. Number 9. Old Croghan Man. In June of 2003, workers clearing a drainage ditch through a peat bog near Croghan Hill in County Offaly, Ireland, found something no drainage crew expects. It was the torso of a man, dark as old leather, the skin still intact over the muscle. Only the upper body survived. The head and the legs were gone, never recovered. Radiocarbon dating placed his death in the Iron Age, somewhere between 360 and 175 BC. He had been a giant. Reconstructing his height from the arm bones gives a figure of around 6 feet 6 inches, towering over his contemporaries. His hands tell their own story. The nails were manicured, and the skin was smooth, the hands of a man who had never done heavy labor. This was almost certainly a person of high rank, and he had been destroyed with deliberate ceremonial cruelty. Holes had been cut clean through both of his upper arms. Through those holes, someone had threaded a rope woven from hazel branches, binding him in place. He was stabbed in the chest. His nipples were sliced, and then his body was cut in half across the torso. On his left arm, there is a defensive wound, the mark of a man who raised his arm to shield himself from a blade. Whatever happened to him, he saw it coming. The details are not random. In early Irish society, sucking a king's nipples was a gesture of submission and loyalty. To slice a man's nipples was to make him incapable of ever being king. Edward Kelly of the National Museum of Ireland has argued that bodies like this one were failed kings, or sacrifices tied to the land and to sovereignty itself. Many were placed on tribal boundaries, near the hills where kings were crowned. His fingernails preserved a record of his diet. In his final months, he had eaten a great deal of meat, the food of the wealthy. But his very last meal was humble: cereals and buttermilk, which may point to a particular ritual season. Remarkably, the bog preserved his fingerprints, still readable after more than 2,000 years. He was found within months of another Irish bog body, Croghan Man, in the same year. So we have two readings. The mainstream one is sacrifice, a king offered to guarantee the fertility of the land. A more political reading sees an elite rival executed and mutilated to erase his claim. A speculative version ties his death to a border dispute, his body a warning laid on the edge of a territory. Bogs preserve the tortured, but dry ground preserves the weapons that did the work. Number 8. Racton Man. In 1989, a skeleton was unearthed near Racton, close to Chichester in West Sussex, England. Beside him lay a dagger of bronze and copper, fixed with rivets. For years, the burial sat quietly in a museum. Then, modern dating turned it into something extraordinary. The man had died around 2300 to 2150 BC, at the very dawn of the British Bronze Age, and the dagger beside him was about 4,200 years old, the earliest securely dated bronze object ever found in Britain. That single weapon anchors a whole chapter of technology. It was made during the transition between copper and bronze, when metalworkers were only beginning to master the alloy. To be buried with such an object, you had to matter, and Racton Man clearly did. He stood around 6 feet tall, well above the average of his time, and he had lived past the age of 45, which made him an old man by Bronze Age standards. He did not die peacefully. A fine blade had sliced through the lower end of his left arm bone, a cut that had not begun to heal. There was a second wound near his right elbow, again from a sharp weapon, again with no sign of healing. Read together, the injuries describe a man raising his arms to fend off an attacker who was striking to kill. This was death in combat. The bones also carried the ordinary wear of a long life, chronic problems in the spine and the teeth. Isotope and skeletal analysis let researchers reconstruct his stature, his diet, and his infirmities, and the results were published in the Antiquaries Journal. Today, he is displayed at the Novium Museum in Chichester, skeleton and dagger together. Why does an old chief die with a blade in his arm? The mainstream reading is simple and grim. He was an elite warrior, killed in a fight, perhaps defending his position. A second reading sees ritualized combat, a duel fought at a moment of social transition. A more speculative idea imagines the ceremonial killing of an aging leader whose time had passed. His rich, solitary grave marks a real shift in human society, away from the shared tombs of the Neolithic and toward the individual, ranked burial of the Bronze Age. 4,200 years feels impossibly old, and yet it is recent compared to what comes next. Because a skeleton stained deep red once pushed the clock of human ritual all the way back into the Ice Age, and it did so under a name that was completely wrong. Number 7. The Paviland Red Lady. In 1823, William Buckland, the first reader in geology at Oxford, was digging in a cave called Goat's Hole at Paviland on the Gower coast of South Wales. He was surrounded by the bones of mammoths and other Ice Age animals when he uncovered a human skeleton stained a deep red. Beside it lay beads made from seashells and rods carved from ivory. Buckland decided the bones belonged to a woman, and the find took the name it still carries, the Red Lady of Paviland. He was wrong on almost every count. The red came from ochre, a pigment deliberately scattered over the body. The skeleton was not a woman at all, but a young man of around 21. And the age Buckland assigned, the Roman period, roughly 2,000 years ago, was off by a staggering margin. Buckland was a clergyman who could not accept that humans had lived in a truly deep past, so he forced the burial into a timeline he found comfortable. In 2008, refined radiocarbon dating using an ultrafiltration method finally settled the question. The Red Lady is around 33 to 34,000 years old. That makes this one of the oldest ceremonial burials known in all of Western Europe. This was not a body dumped in a cave. It was carefully laid out, dusted in red ochre, and surrounded by treasures, periwinkle shell beads, ivory rods and rings, worked bone and antler. The world he was buried in looked nothing like today. The cave did not overlook the sea, but a broad plain, and Britain was still joined to continental Europe. He lived and died in the Gravettian period of the Upper Paleolithic. His skull and some other bones are missing, lost to time or to the excavation. What remains is kept at the Oxford University Museum of Natural History, though there are ongoing calls to return him to Wales. Isotope studies suggest he ate a good deal of food from the sea or the rivers, but the deepest meaning of the burial is not in his diet. It is in the ochre and the beads. 30,000 years before farming, before writing, before cities, people gathered to bury one of their own with color and ornament and care. The mainstream reading is clear symbolic burial. The old reading, Buckland's Roman Woman, has been overturned for good. Grief in the Ice Age is one thing when the dead is a young adult. It is another thing entirely when the dead is a tiny child, preserved so perfectly that a modern doctor can read the illness that killed them. Number 6. The Detmold Child. There is a mummy that carries the name of a German town, but the child inside it was born and died in ancient Peru. Radiocarbon dating puts the little body at around 6,500 years old. To grasp that, consider that this infant died roughly 3,000 years before the birth of Tutankhamun and long before the first Egyptian pyramid was raised. The name Detmold Child comes from the Lipsius Landis Museum in the German town of Detmold, where the mummy is kept and studied. The child was between 8 and 10 months old at death. The little body was arranged in the traditional pose of the region, eyes closed, arms folded, the legs drawn up toward the chest. For thousands of years, the cause of death was a mystery. Then the mummy was placed inside a high-resolution scanner at the North Rhine-Westphalia Heart and Diabetes Center, and the machine looked straight through the wrappings and into the chest. What the scan revealed was heartbreaking in the most literal sense. The infant had a rare and usually fatal condition called hypoplastic left heart syndrome. The imaging showed a small left ventricle and a small hole between the chambers of the heart. In this condition, the left side of the heart simply fails to develop the way it should. In the modern world, it demands surgery within days of birth. 6,500 years ago, it was a death sentence. The heart defect did not act alone. The researchers concluded that the malformation, combined with a bout of pneumonia, is what ended the child's short life. The scans found other troubles too: a deficiency of vitamin D and a skull that had grown into an abnormal cone-like shape. Small flat rectangular pendants were buried with the body, tiny tokens of care for an infant who lived less than a year. The preservation is a gift of the Peruvian environment, dry enough to desiccate the tissue before it could rot. This makes the Detmold Child one of the oldest naturally preserved mummies anywhere on Earth, and one of the oldest human beings in whom a congenital heart defect has ever been identified. The heart study was published in the medical journal The Lancet in 2014. Because the scan works without unwrapping the body, nothing had to be destroyed to reach the diagnosis. A baby who died before the pyramids can now teach a cardiologist about a failing heart. Preservation lets us read an illness across 65 centuries. And when preservation reaches even deeper, it stops telling us how someone died and starts asking what we even are. Number 5. The Lapedo Child. In late November of 1998, 2 survey workers were examining a rock shelter called Lagar Velho in the Lapedo Valley of central Portugal. They noticed loose sediment spilling from a rodent hole at the back wall. That small disturbance led to one of the most argued over burials in the study of human origins. Inside was the nearly complete skeleton of a child about 4 years old, given the label Lagar Velho 1, and known ever since as the Lapedo Child. The burial was tender and formal. The body had been covered in red ochre and laid on a bed of burnt vegetation. With it were pierced red deer teeth and a marine shell. Ornaments in the Gravettian style used by modern humans across Europe at the time. Everything about the grave said modern human, but the bones themselves said something stranger. The excavation was led by the archaeologist João Zilhão, and when he and the anatomist Eric Trinkhaus studied the skeleton, they found a mosaic. The child had the chin and the forearms of a modern human, but it had the jaw and the stocky, powerful build of a Neanderthal, and its lower legs were short and robust in the cold-adapted Neanderthal pattern. Their conclusion was explosive. This child, they argued, was the descendant of interbreeding between Neanderthals and modern humans. The claim ignited a fight that has never fully settled. Critics countered that a chunky, big-boned child still falls within the natural range of modern human variation, and that no hybrid was required to explain it. For years the argument stalled. Then the dating itself shifted. The original estimate was around 24,500 years ago. But new radiocarbon work in 2025, using a purified component of the bone collagen, pushed the age back to roughly 27 to 28,000 years before present. That revised date deepens the mystery, because it means the child lived thousands of years after the Neanderthals are thought to have vanished. If Neanderthal features still appeared that late, they must have been carried in a mixed population, not inherited from a Neanderthal parent. And here, the wider science has caught up with Zilhão. Modern genetics has proven that people outside Africa carry Neanderthal DNA in their genomes today. The interbreeding he proposed from a single small skeleton turned out to be a real chapter in our ancestry. The mainstream reading now sees hybrid ancestry preserved in a population. The critical reading still sees only a robust modern child. Either way, someone dusted a 4-year-old in red ochre and laid it to rest with care. Cut marks on a child's grave here mean love. On the next skull, cut marks mean something colder. Number 4. The Bodo Cranium. In 1976, a team working in the Middle Awash Valley of Ethiopia, at a place called Bodo Dar, recovered a human skull from the ancient sediment. It is around 600,000 years old, a span of time that dwarfs everything else in this list. The skull sits between two kinds of human. It has the heavy brow ridges, the massive face, and the thick bones of Homo erectus. But its brain case holds around 1,250 cubic centimeters, within the range of modern humans. Most experts classify it as Homo heidelbergensis. It is one of the largest human faces ever found. But size is not what makes this skull disturbing. When researchers examined the surface closely, they found cut marks. There are fine incisions across the vault, across the face, and even inside the eye socket. These are not scratches from the ground or the teeth of an animal. They match the damage that stone tools make when they cut through flesh on fresh bone. The scientist Tim White studied these marks and published his analysis in 1986. His conclusion was that the Bodo skull had been intentionally defleshed. Someone, 600,000 years ago, had used sharp stone tools to strip the soft tissue from another individual's head. This stands as the earliest solid evidence anywhere for the deliberate defleshing of a human ancestor. The obvious question is why, and here the honesty of the science matters. We do not know. There is no evidence of cooking on the bone, and no clear tooth marks, so we cannot say the skull was eaten. Cannibalism is possible, but unproven. The defleshing could just as easily have been a mortuary rite, a way of processing the dead, or the curation of a skull kept for some meaning we can no longer read. The skull was found on its own, with no grave and no body attached to it. Later work used three-dimensional computed tomography to measure the brain case precisely, and the Bodo site also produced Acheulean hand axes, the sophisticated stone tools of the period. The skull was discovered in 1976 by a team working under the researchers Asfaw, Whitehead, and Wood. As a fossil, it bridges a frustrating gap in the African record of the Middle Pleistocene, a time we know too little about, and casts of it are studied around the world, including by the Smithsonian's Human Origins Program. The mainstream reading is careful. This was post-mortem defleshing, for reasons unknown. A more speculative reading imagines the ritual removal of a face, or the taking of a trophy. What we can say is that the human habit of doing deliberate things to the dead is at least 600,000 years old, and the next skull was handled not with a blade, but with hands that seem to have refused to let go. Number 3. The Herto Skulls. In November of 1997, the paleoanthropologist Tim White was walking near the village of Herto in the Middle Awash region of Ethiopia when he spotted the butchered skull of a fossil hippopotamus lying on the ground. Where ancient people had butchered animals, ancient people themselves might be found. The site went on to yield 3 human skulls, 2 from adults and 1 from a child. Dating of the surrounding volcanic layers placed them at around 160,000 years old. At the time of their publication in the journal Nature in 2003, these were the oldest known fossils of anatomically modern humans on Earth. White and his colleagues gave them a new name, Homo sapiens idaltu. The word idaltu means elder in the Afar language, a fitting title for the oldest members of our own kind. The child's skull was found by the Ethiopian scientist Berhane Asfaw. That child was about 6 or 7 years old, and the skull had shattered into roughly 200 fragments, which had to be painstakingly pieced back together. The reconstructed faces sit right on the edge of full modernity, still carrying a little of the old robustness, but recognizably like us. And then there is the detail that lifts the hair on the neck. The surface of the child's skull is polished, not by sediment, but by handling. Something, or someone, held this child's skull again and again after death, until the bone took on a shine. The adult skulls tell a similar story. They too bear cut marks, and they too show polishing. But the researchers were careful in how they read this. They did not conclude cannibalism. Instead, they saw a mortuary practice, a treatment of the dead that resembles rituals recorded much later among living peoples, where the skulls of ancestors are kept, cleaned, carried, and honored. 160,000 years ago, at the very dawn of our species, people may have been curating the remains of their loved ones. The site preserved evidence of butchered hippos and other large animals, so the population hunted big game. The skulls fill a critical gap at the start of modern human anatomy, and they strengthen the case that Homo sapiens arose in Africa. The mainstream reading is a symbolic curation of the dead, a gesture of memory and grief rather than violence. A minority reading suggests defleshing for consumption, but it is largely rejected. Here, then, the dead were held with care. In a Spanish cave 49,000 years ago, another group was handled with none. Number 2. El Sidrón. In a cave system in Asturias, in the green northwest of Spain, a set of ancient bones came to light in 1994. Careful excavation from the year 2000 through 2009 revealed something that goes beyond a single burial. The remains belong to about 12 or 13 individuals, and the evidence suggests they were a single family group. Roughly 7 adults, 3 adolescents, and 3 young children. They lived around 49,000 years ago. they were Neanderthals. And they were eaten. The bones carry the unmistakable signs. There are cut marks from stone tools across the skeletons, where flesh was removed. The long bones were deliberately cracked open, the way you crack a bone to reach the marrow inside. The skulls were broken, possibly to get at the brain. This was not a burial. This was butchery, carried out on an entire family at around the time they died. Then, in a grim stroke of luck for science, the floor of the cave collapsed soon after, burying the remains quickly and sealing them away. That rapid burial did something remarkable. It preserved the Neanderthal DNA well enough to be read tens of thousands of years later. And El Sidrón became one of the richest sources of Neanderthal genetics ever found. The genetics turned a horror into a portrait. The adult males all shared the same maternal lineage, while the females carried different ones. This pattern points to a society where the men stayed with their birth group and the women moved between groups, a structure called patrilocality. The DNA also revealed that at least one individual carried a gene variant for red hair, and another for the ability to taste certain bitter compounds. Skeletal abnormalities throughout the group suggest inbreeding, which some researchers believe contributed to the decline of the Neanderthals. Even the hardened plaque on their teeth spoke. Trapped inside it were traces of the plants they ate, and evidence of self-medication. One individual had consumed poplar, which contains salicylic acid, the natural basis of aspirin. A sick Neanderthal may have been dosing itself with a painkiller. The excavation team worked under strict controls to avoid contaminating these bones with modern human DNA. Why would a family be butchered and eaten by their own kind? The leading explanation is nutritional stress, cannibalism forced by the brutal scarcity of the Ice Age. Hunger can explain a starving band consuming the dead. But hunger cannot explain 37 people thrown down a shaft in a land of plenty. Number 1. Charterhouse Warren. In the Mendip Hills of Somerset, in the southwest of England, there is a natural shaft in the rock about 15 meters deep. At the bottom of it, archaeologists found the remains of at least 37 people. Men, women, children. They date to the early Bronze Age, around 2200 to 2000 BC. And what was done to them makes this the largest scale act of human violence known from all of British prehistory. The bones were studied by a team led by Professor Rick Schulting of the University of Oxford, and their findings were published in the journal Antiquity in December of 2024. The paper carries a chilling title, drawn from a phrase about human nature, the darker angels of our nature. Nearly half of the roughly 20 recovered skulls show fatal wounds from blunt weapons, most likely wooden clubs. These people were beaten to death. Then the violence continued past death. There are cut marks on the leg bones, where flesh was stripped away. The ends of the long bones are fractured in the pattern left by marrow extraction. And there are human tooth marks on the bones of hands and feet and on the ribs. The victims were not only killed, they were butchered and, the evidence strongly suggests, eaten. Thrown down into the shaft with them were the butchered bones of cattle and other animals, mixed in with the people as if to erase any line between them. Professor Schulting was direct about how singular this is. There had been, he noted, no previous indication of violence on this scale in Britain at that time, neither in the number of victims nor in the way they were treated after death. What could drive it? His team proposes a spiraling cycle of revenge between or within communities that escalated far past any normal bound. It may have begun with something small, a theft, or an accusation of witchcraft, and then spun out of control. The cannibalism, the researchers argue, was not about hunger. It was about othering, an act meant to strip the victims of their humanity, to treat enemies as less than people. Some of the dead carried older, healed injuries, hinting at earlier rounds of conflict. And in a further twist, the DNA of the plague bacterium was detected in a couple of the individuals, raising a debate about whether disease, played any part in the disaster. One shaft holds the end of an entire community. 10 discoveries now lie behind us, from a serene face in a Danish bog to a pit of shattered bone in Somerset. So what ties them all together? The first thread is the simplest, and it is not about people at all. It is about chemistry. Every one of these discoveries survived because of where it lay. The bogs that held Tollund Man and old Croghan Man are acidic, waterlogged, and starved of oxygen. The sphagnum moss releases a compound that locks up nitrogen and shuts down the bacteria of decay, tanning skin into leather. But that same acid dissolves bone, which is why bog bodies give us faces, and almost no skeleton. The dry environment of coastal Peru did the opposite for the Detmold Child. It pulled the moisture out of the tissue so fast that rot never took hold, leaving bone and organ intact. Sealed caves, like the one at Paviland and the collapsed chamber at El Sidrón, buffer the swings of temperature and humidity, and a sudden burial by falling sediment protects both bone and the fragile DNA inside it. So, preservation is a lottery, and the ticket decides what we get. A bog hands us a human expression but no genome, because its acid dissolves the very bone that holds the DNA. A cave collapse hands us a genome but scattered bone. Cold and dry conditions, like permafrost and sealed caves, preserve ancient DNA best of all. A desert hands us a whole child. The environment, not the intention of the people, decides how much of the dead survives to disturb us. And once a body survives, the real questions begin with the marks left on the bones. How do researchers tell a sacrifice from a murder or a funeral from a feast? The clues are written into the bone itself. The timing of a break can reveal whether it happened around death or long after, because fresh bone fractures differently from dry bone. A cut made by a stone tool has a distinct profile, different from the gnawing of an animal or the scrape of sediment, and archaeologists confirm this by cutting fresh bone with replica tools and comparing the marks. Certain patterns point specifically to processing for food. Long bones cracked at the ends signal marrow extraction. Human tooth marks, like those at Charterhouse Warren, are direct evidence of chewing. But defleshing on its own is ambiguous. It can mean cannibalism, or it can mean a mortuary rite, or the careful curation of a skull. The Bodo Cranium and the Herto Skulls carry cut marks with no proof of consumption, so they are read as ritual. El Sidrón and Charterhouse carry cut marks plus cracked marrow bones and chewing, so they are read as cannibalism. Isotopes add diet. Ancient DNA adds kinship and disease. And context, the animals, the spacing, the setting, tips the balance. This ambiguity is exactly why these finds unsettle the experts. The same cut on the same bone can be an act of love or an act of slaughter. The bone does not carry the horror. The interpretation does. It is worth saying plainly that these discoveries disturb the professionals who make them. The excavators at Charterhouse Warren spoke openly about how hard the site was to process. The finders of Tollund Man called the police, certain they had stumbled on a murder. Across the peatlands of Europe, workers have fled in fright at the sight of a face rising from the ground. Part of this is the collapse of time. To look into a preserved face is to have thousands of years vanish in an instant until the dead feel like a contemporary. The child burials hit hardest of all. The Detmold infant, the Lapedo 4-year-old, the polished skull of the Herto Child. Each one asks the researcher to stay clinical over remains that beg for grief. There is also the weight of not knowing. When the motive behind a death is uncertain, the mind fills the gap, and the possibilities are rarely comforting. Modern debates over ethics and repatriation, like the call to return the Red Lady to Wales, add another layer, a reminder that these are people, not specimens. To excavate them is to be changed by them, and running underneath all of it is a set of questions that no amount of digging has answered. For all the science, The mysteries outnumber the solutions. Was Tollund Man a sacrifice, an execution, or somehow both at once? Why were the Bog Kings tortured with such precise, symbolic cruelty? Was the defleshing of the Bodo skull a ritual or a meal? Is the Lapedo Child truly a hybrid, or simply a sturdy modern child dressed up by our expectations? At Charterhouse Warren, was the trigger a cycle of revenge, or did disease play its part? How common was cannibalism among the Neanderthals, and was it always driven by hunger? What did the people of Herto mean by polishing a child's skull, and how many more bog bodies still lie undiscovered beneath the peat, waiting for a spade? Every new technique reopens these old cases. Refined radiocarbon dating pushed the Red Lady into the Ice Age and shifted the Lapedo Child by thousands of years. Ancient DNA rewrote the family of Sidrón and confirmed the Neanderthal ancestry hidden in living people. Even the parasites in Tollund Man's gut and the aspirin compound in a Neanderthal's dental plaque were invisible to earlier generations of scientists. Each answer we win seems to unlock two more questions. The past does not close. It keeps reopening. 10 discoveries, and one thread runs through all of them. The dead refuse to stay silent. Preservation is a matter of luck, a gift of acid or ice or dry desert air. But meaning is never given for free. It has to be argued, wound by wound, cut mark by cut mark. These finds terrify because they are not abstractions. They are a face with stubble on the chin, a baby with a failing heart, a shaft packed with the end of a village. They hold tenderness and cruelty side by side, sometimes in the very same grave, and they refuse to let us pretend the two are separate. A serene face in a bog and a pit of shattered bone are, in the end, the same story. The story of what it means to be mortal. From these remains, science can now read illness, kinship, diet, and violence, more with every passing year. And yet every answer raises another question, and the people who bring these bodies back into the light carry them for the rest of their lives. To unearth the dead is to be changed by them. That is why, thousands of years on, they still have the power to terrify.